In this next section, we're going to talk about culture and language. If you're interested in the way language and culture influence each other and are related, you might be interested in taking a class in sociology or anthropology because both of those focus on societies and cultures. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion of the overlap between culture and language. So this bit is not in the textbook. The first theory that I want to talk about is called linguistic determinism. If something determines something, it basically makes it that way. So this theory says language determines culture and vice versa. Culture determines language. So language both shapes and reflects culture. Let me give you an example. Let's say, oh, in fact, I read an article, I can't remember what language it was. I believe it was a Scandinavian language where there's no difference between present tense and future tense. So let's say that you as a culture, you don't think about like my future self, right? Or the future in terms of that's a long way away, I don't have to worry about that. You think of it as the future is now. So this is a culture that thinks of the future is now. It is very immediate. So your language develops to reflect that. You don't need a different tense for future because the future is now. So kids growing up hearing and speaking this language, they just automatically think of the future as now. So for example, I wouldn't be able to say, I will retire in 20 years. Instead, I would say, I retire in 20 years, or I am retiring in 20 years. And we kind of have that in English, like I would say, I am retiring in 20 years. But the difference is in this language that I can't remember which language it was, they are not able to say, I will retire in 20 years. It's just always, I am retiring in 20 years. So who do you think is better at saving for their retirement? People who speak that language, where there's no difference between present tense and future tense? Or people who speak English, where there is a difference between present tense and future tense? Yes, it is the people who speak that language. They are way better at planning for their retirement because for them, the future is now. So it's not like, that's a problem for my future self. No, it's a problem for me right now and I'm going to solve it. So the way you talk influences the way you think, of course, which we've mentioned before, and that happens at a cultural level. So the way the culture sees the world influences how the language develops in that culture. And then the way that language develops influences the way the culture functions. So it's like this feedback loop. So for example, when I teach this in class, we do an exercise where I have students, I write on the board the word chair, and I say, tell me all the words you can think of for the word chair, all the synonyms you can think of. And usually we come up with about like 7 to 10, things like stool or rocker or lazy boy or recliner, things like that. Then I write money. And I say, give me all the synonyms you can think of for the word money. And oh my gosh, we fill up the board. Cash, dough, moolah, green, greenbacks, dead presidents, bills, bucks, dinero. I mean, it goes on and on. And then I step back and I look at the board and I say, all right, if you were a sociologist or an anthropologist studying our culture, which would you think is more important in our culture, chairs or money? And it's pretty clear, money is important in our culture. So if you value something in your culture values something like we value money, then your language is going to reflect that. You're going to have a lot of words for the word money. And then you grow up hearing people talk about money all the time, and you just assume that money is the most important thing. So just because you hear it talked about, right, your language influences your thinking. That's linguistic determinism. Now, there's another theory that dovetails with this. It's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it's an example of linguistic determinism. In fact, some textbooks, the ones that do include this section on culture and language, they will sometimes use the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis as a proxy for linguistic determinism. They don't even mention linguistic determinism, they just talk about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir and Whorf were linguists, researchers, anthropologists, and their job was to go into different cultures around the world, and they would live in the culture, and they would learn the language, and they would learn the traditions and customs and norms and artifacts that were important in the culture and beliefs and values. And then they would basically write about it and published their writings in a journal so that the rest of us could read and learn about, the Balinese culture or whatever. So one time, Sapir and Whorf went and lived with the Hopi Native American Indians. And if you're not familiar with the Hopi culture, you've probably seen old photographs from the 1800s of adobe apartment houses, sort of. That's the Hopi culture. So that's pretty much the Hopi culture. That's the best I can tell you. You can Google it if you want to learn more about the Hopi culture. But when Sapir and Whorf went and lived with the Hopi people, and they were trying so hard to learn the language, and they had a terrible time. They had a really hard time learning the language. And they were like, why is this so difficult? We've never had such a hard time learning a language before. And finally, they figured it out, and they found that it was because it was just such a different language than any they had encountered before. What they found was, and this is oversimplified, but in general, the Hopi language has very few nouns. Instead, it uses mostly verbs. So remember your parts of speech, a noun is a person, place, or thing. A verb is an action word like running or jumping or teaching, right? So as a result of this, the Hopi people tend to automatically think of the world as being in a constant state of flux. Flux means flow or change. So in the Hopi mindset, in the Hopi culture, very few things are stable or permanent because they don't use nouns to talk about the world. They use verbs. So very quick example, I right now am teaching. Does that make me permanently and forever a teacher? It does not. Later on, I'm going to go read a book. That doesn't make me permanently and forever a reader. It just means I'm reading at that point. So right now I'm teaching. Later on, I'll be reading. So I'm not a teacher or a reader. In the Hopi mindset, I would be engaging in activities, right? It would be action words, process words. And even for things that we would think of as nouns, like a boulder. Let's say that there's a boulder here. Well, yeah, it's a boulder right now, but in the Hopi culture, you don't think of things in terms of this hour or this day or even this lifetime. You think of things in terms of many lifetimes down the road, so many generations into the future. So yeah, right now this is a boulder, but later on there's going to be wind and rain and erosion, and it's going to turn into gravel. So instead of saying this is a boulder, in the Hopi language you'd say it's bouldering. It's in the process of bouldering, and later on it'll be graveling. It'll be in the process of being gravel, because on some level everything is in a state of flux. If you have a long-term mindset, if you look long enough into the future. So you can imagine how hard it was to learn this language, because at Sapir and Whorf, their mindset was just completely different from that. And they were not used to languages that treated the world as being in a constant state of flux. But you think about it, you grow up in that culture and you're automatically going to think of the world as being in a constant state of flux. So for the Hopi people, they tend to automatically think of the world as being in a constant state of flux. Very few things are stable or permanent. So sometimes I ask my students, if you are bilingual, like if you speak two languages, and a lot of times students, like their parents spoke a different language, and so they grew up speaking that other language and also English. And I'll say, for those of you who are bilingual, are there things that it's easier to think about in one language versus the other one? And they'll go, oh yeah, absolutely. There are some things that, like, the concept just doesn't exist in English, so I can't even really think about it in English. I can only think about it in, my parents' language or whatever. So yeah, I think that's a really good example of how the way we talk influences the way we think. And of course, the way we think influences the way we talk. So that is chapter 4. We talked about language, misunderstandings that can come from our language use, disruptive language, where conflict arises because of the way we're using the language, gender and language, and finally, culture and language. So I hope that this was kind of a good overview of chapter 4, and I hope that you enjoyed it.